All right, cool. So check this out. I want to do just a really quick walkthrough of how to do terrains inside of Houdini and use the vegetation tool to add some detail. So this is using the some surfaces from the Megascan Quixel library. I brought those into Houdini via the bridge, and then brought these together with the terrain setup. Okay. So first off, we're going to take a look at my top level here. I've got the terrain generation happening here in the terrain mountain. I have a simple light scene where there's a procedural sky environment and a sun that's connected to that. This is the resulting render that we're going to see from that terrain map. So it's stopped there. We have a camera, right? All the simple things, ROPNet. This is just our setup for our simple render. Okay, so if we go in here into our scene, and the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to start with a height field. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. We're going to come into scene view, and let me turn off hide the other things. Our height field is just this grid at the bottom of our frame. All right, so there's the grid. In this case, we're using a tube to simulate a mountain, right? Very simple here. You can see that it doesn't take a whole lot. Our tube has a center, right? It's got a height and a radius, very simple. We use a height field project to use geometry with the height field, and this creates now a height field based off of that. Brings those two together. We use a blur to kind of soften out some of those edges. Again, this is all to taste. This actually was built off of the default shelf button, but it does a great job, right? So if you come up to here to terrain, if you have this shelf loaded in right over here, you go to this and you can see shelf sets, and there's a terrain tool in here somewhere, or it's the plus button. There you go. And so it's terrain effects. So there we go. So now we're going to do some distortion, right? So it's curl noise, kind of breaks that up. So that's one level, and some of this I've added a little bit more here. Then I do another level where that brings in a little bit more detail, and already you can see this is getting kind of interesting, right? Where it's like, all right, cool, it's kind of being mountainy, and then there's some additional noise that's applied here. So one is a distortion, the other one is an additive noise, and so that helps to kind of bring this. And there's a million ways. There's no right or wrong here. This is just getting something that's your base level, and you can see that the mountain is pretty tall. I find that when you simulate, it's better to simulate on like a steeper terrain than it is on a flatter terrain. You can, it gives you a very different look. Okay, so now we have this, and then we have our first height field erode node. And you can see I have it set to freeze the simulation at frame 20. In 18, they redid the simulations on this, either 18 or 17, and it takes very few frames to get to a really good looking result. So let's go ahead and just go to frame 1, and we're going to take a look at this node, and this is what it looks like right here. Let's see, is that frame 1? Is that the result at frame 1? That shouldn't be. Let's say reset simulation. That should just be, there, it's cooking. It's cooking. Bob's your uncle, Betty's your aunt. And I guess that was frame 1. So there's frame 1 of our erode simulation, okay? And then as we just start stepping through this, we'll see this start to erode more and more and more. It's not doing that, so I've got something amiss. Oh, it's because I have the freeze set. There you go. So if I turn this off, it'll allow this to kind of step through these, right? So if we come back, if I turn off the freeze, you see there's the first, and then you can just start walking through and seeing this erosion process take place, right? And again, I go to frame 20. You see how like not a whole lot is changing at this point, right? It's just kind of moving some stuff around. It's building up maybe a little bit more in these areas, but not a whole lot is changing. So we're going to freeze at frame 20. And now from here, this is fairly low res and not really doing everything that I want it to do. There's some stuff in here. I think most of this is out of the box. I didn't really change a whole lot. What I did change was the bank angle, I believe, on the main, and what this is how steep of a cut this makes. I either did it on this one or the secondary one. So now what I do is I have my first erode. I think this is all default. I run it through a few frames to get something which is different than this, right? So you see there, and then we get to here, and we're starting to get some different erosion patterns that are happening in here. Now I'm going to come through and I'm going to do another distort, okay? Just because I just like adding I like adding in this breakup, right, to get something that's really starting to feel organic, okay? And then I'm going to resample this, and what the resample does is I'm increasing the number of voxels, so you see I get a smoother result. And now I'm going to run this again through another heightfield erode. And this one, I'm resetting the water layer, the debris layer, and the sediment layer. And you don't have to do this, but what it does is it just kind of takes everything from the previous simulation, throws it away, and allows you to kind of start from scratch. You can build off of this if you want to. Oftentimes when I'll do a third layer, I won't reset these. I'll leave them as they are, but I'll do things like add water layer to final height. That way you get like a clamped water layer here, and you can see if I do that, you'll see when we run this that that level wouldn't be this kind of bumpy divot. It would flatten that out. So if we go to main, I can't remember what I changed in this, to be honest with you. It was the cut angle. There you go. This is one of the things that I changed. So the higher this angle is, the steeper a more cut you're going to get. So now we're just going to go ahead and we'll click this. This is also limited to frame 20, I believe. Yeah, so it goes through and runs 20 frames. And so now you can start to see, now we're getting some very interesting looking effects. And this is very like Lord of the Rings, like Mordor, right? You know, it's like I expect the Eye of Sauron to be up here. But it gives me kind of a nice starting place that I can build from. So now I come in and I use a remap node, okay? And you hit compute range here and it'll map this, and this is the original input and output. I just changed that to 0 to 200. So then we click that. Now you see it's something not quite so extreme. This feels more like a proper mountain range. So now I can start creating some masks. I use masks to drive some of my vegetation and shader work. So in this case, we'll see here we create a mask based on a feature. So it's the mask layer it makes is height. In this case, you have all these different types of parameters that you can use. You can use slope, you can use height, peaks and valleys, direction, occlusion. In this case, I'm using the occlusion mask, and where it's red, you can see that's the mask I'm getting. So it's giving me this area of occlusion that I can then do things with in my shaders. And so there's one mask that I create, and then I use a heightfield copy layer, and what that allows me to do is to take the mask and give it a new destination layer. In this case, I call it OCC, right? Because right now I'm gonna break this, right? I'm gonna make a new mask, and this one I'm using slope, right, to get a different mask pattern. And so you can see now it gives me other areas of control, and you play with these, you use different ones, peaks and valleys, occlusion, direction. There's all kinds of cool stuff. I like to use direction because on mountains you're gonna get vegetation that grows on the northeastern facing slopes are going to be your most vegetated slopes, where your southwestern slopes are going to be your most arid slopes, at least in the northern hemisphere. And so it gives you this ability to kind of create maps based on that, right? So now we've got this, and I come in here and I've changed this to be slope, okay? In this case, I've gone ahead and converted this to a piece of geometry, right? So we come here and now I've got geo, and I've UV textured this piece of geo, okay? And I've written this out to disk. Now I'm adding a material here, and we'll go into that, creating the materials. So before I can create the material, I create this cop net, right? This is where you do compositing inside of Houdini. So I go into the cop net, and I use a SOP import. So if you right click and you go into import and you do SOP import, I've added, my SOP is just right here, right, which is this out height. And so if you're new to Houdini, this is just a path, right? Just like Windows, Linux. And so dot dot would be, so one dot slash is the directory I'm in, dot dot slash is to go up a directory, or maybe that's the directory I'm in, and then dot dot, I think this works too. If I do it like that, nope, see it turned red, didn't like that. So this takes me up out of my cop net and finds this out height and brings it in. So now once this is brought in, if we go to our composite view, right, you need to set planes from the SOP, and you'll see that what that creates is here under the custom planes. It's going to go ahead and create these different images that it brings in. These are there's your mask, your bedrock, sediment. These are all things that are generated in the simulation, right? Plus, when we get to the end here, there's the occlusion and the slope that we've created. So now we have those as well. I've ridden the size, and I've made it a 2K map for ease. Powers of 2, especially if you're using this in Unreal, you want to make sure you're using powers of 2. And this allows me to create a high-res texture if I need to. I find that 2K is more than plenty. I can do some, fit range type stuff to kind of sharpen these up, but it works really well. Again, for far away things, if you're walking on this mountain, you're gonna need a better map than that. But for background, mid-ground stuff, it works fantastic. And we can see here are all these different layers, right? Here's sediment, height, debris, right? Water. And then here's our occlusion map that we made, and here's our slope. And then now I write these out to disk, because you can use these right in the shader. It just is much more, it's less intensive to write these out. So I throw down a ROP, right? So you go to export, ROP file output. And then the only thing I change here is you can path this however you need to. I make sure I restrict it just to frame 20, because that's, I don't want to write out a frame range, and I want it to just grab the frame that we kind of dictated as like, this is the frame to view it at, just to be sure. And I go through and I write out all the different control channels that I want to use in my shaders. So in this case, I'm using debris, water, slope, and occlusion. I use a PNG. You can use whatever you want here as far as what it outputs. I think your limits are, it should write to just about anything, but EXRs are good, PNGs are good. And then for your color plane and your alpha plane, you just put in here, right? If you click here, you'll see, you just pick which one you wanna output. And there you go. So then I write all those masks to disk, and then once I've done that, now I can bring these back in and modify them. So we're gonna go back to our scene view. Right, here's our mountain, and remember, this is what our render is gonna end up looking like. And give it a second. We're cooking. All right, so we got that. Now I'm going to come out to my object level, and when I used the bridge to bring stuff in, it drops it right here into this material network. And you could move this and put it someplace else, but I just left it there because I was being fast. So I went ahead and used the bridge, right? Which in this case, let me close some of this stuff. Looks like this, right? So we click this guy, and here's the Quixel bridge. It's taking a second to load. Okay, well anyway, normally this is going to bring up a bunch of stuff, and I think I've already put up a video about how to use this bridge. And so you just go and grab surfaces, right? So in this case, we're going to grab surfaces, whatever that might be. You know, you're going to pick something. I go into rock, right? So go into rock. I found I like jagged or cliff, right? You go into these guys and you find stuff that's really interesting. Like this actually looks like it would have been pretty cool to grab something like that. I haven't used that before. So you bring any of this stuff in, and you're going to use these as control images, or as our shaders. So I've brought in the Icelandic cracked rock, I've brought in cracked rock surface, and I've brought in mine rock wall, along with wind-swept snowy stones. Okay, and here's some shaders that I tried that I didn't end up liking, right? So I just brought in some other things, right? Fresh wind-swept snow, 2 different types. Okay. So now to do this, we're going to use the layer mix, and we're going to plug one shader into one shader into the other, and then into our alpha, we're going to bring in, let me go ahead and make this larger. We're going to go ahead and bring in a texture. So in this case, you see we're using the occlusion mask to split between these 2 different rocks, cracked rock and Icelandic cracked rock. And then I take that and I use a vector to float, so I can grab a single channel, right? And I'm going to put that into a fit node. There's probably other ways to do this, better ways to do this, but this is what I did. So then with this fit, I went ahead and remap this to get like a really sharp fall off. Like when I had it 0 to 1, like there was a lot of like mushy blends that I didn't like, and I really wanted to just push this to like black and white, right? You're one rock or you're the other, not kind of this graduation between the two. And so this was the value that worked for those. You can put whatever you want. That's just to taste. Texture-wise, I don't think there was anything special I did. to make those work. I think, if I remember correctly, if you'll humor me, I'm going to go back for a second. Inside of the COP network, to make this work and line up, I think I had to do some UV magic to make this work. Ah, there it is right here. I forgot to go over this. So to make this work and line up, like if you were to just take this, the SOP import, and write it to disk, you'll find that it doesn't work out. You've got to flip it vertically and flop it 90 degrees. You do that, and it's going to work great from this workflow that I have here. If it doesn't line up, that's what you're going to use, right? If you do something and you're like, this isn't working, these are the settings that you would play with. You'd start changing these and just bringing it in. And I used this attribute from map to view that, to try to be able to see it, right? Visualize it, and that was really helpful. So I'm going to go back out to my materials now. And so we've got our first layer mix, right? And now it's just repeat. We go into alpha, we bring in the next one, and we're going to bring in another texture map. In this case, the slope, same thing, vector. And then this is using the same lookup. I have some of these I think have a different lookup, but same. Just goes through that process all the way down to layer mix 3, which is bringing in windswept. And on that one, right, I started to do something that was a little more intensive to get my snow where I wanted it. All right, so I have my texture that I'm bringing in, and I go to a vector to float and a fit node. You see, that's all these have been the same setup. Now I'm putting a maximum with two different other remaps, right? So in this case, I'm using my normals, right? And then vector to float, you see that I'm grabbing the Y-based normal, okay? That's what that value 2 is. I put it into a fit node, and I'm saying everything that's below 0.8 in value, right? Which we know that anything that's pointed up in Y is going to be a positive number, and anything that's pointing down in Y, any face, is going to be a negative number. And so I'm just, again, doing a hard mask between anything that's 0.8 or greater to 0.8.1, right? So 0.8 or less is going to be 0, 0.8.1 and greater is going to be 1, and that gives me a nice mask for anything that's an upward-facing slope, right? It gives me, you know, on the really steep cliffs, this makes it so the snow is not on those really steep cliffs. So I get rock face on those. Then this one is using position, right, where I'm using this to drive elevation. So in this case, anything that's greater than -20 and -22, and this took some playing with because these values were strange to me since I remapped from 0 to 200. I had expected something else, but these were the values that fit. So now I've taken these two and I've minimized those, or I've said give me the least of these, right? So basically what it does is it takes everything that's this upward slope and says just give it to me inside of this elevation remap, and then I max that with my texture map. That way, what that gave me is, when I come into my render view, which may take a second, it gave it so like you see there's snow down here, right? And the trees are covering some of this, but there's snow in these little like crevices and things where oftentimes those parts of a mountain will get very little sunlight. And so in the wintertime and even in the spring, you'll have a lot of snow that's kind of hanging out in these little crags, right? And so I wanted that. And then I wanted really the bulk of this snow to be something that's more elevational. And living close to the mountains, I'll tell you, you get these really interesting, like when a fresh snow will come in, you'll get like a hard line, elevation line of, you know, like above that it was snowing, below that it was raining, you know, or not enough snow to stick. And you get these really interesting lines. Now, you could break that up with some further things where you could take this here, where you take P, and if we wanted to like perturb that line, we could add to this with a turbulent noise. So we could take a turbulent noise and right, we would take P off of that, and then we could add this back in. So add, right, here. So I would take that Y position and I would add that based on this noise, and then use that for this value. So what this is going to do is it's going to create, we're going to make this like scalloped, and this is going to be heavily dependent on frequency and amplitude. You know, you might put like a, you know, multiply by constant in between these. That way you have a value, right? That way sometimes I find that cranking this amplitude, I get some weird stuff, and I just use this outside of that, depending on what noise type you're using. And so this would give you something that gives you some control to kind of start breaking up that line. But for now, I'm content just using it just like this. So we'll leave it like that. And This now, you'll see when you go to add this, if I go back out to my material node here, when I click this to pick it, right? So you see I came here, I clicked the node chooser, opens up this choose operator window. You'll see here that there is no layer mix in this. Don't ask me why that doesn't show up as an option. I don't know if there's a piece that I'm missing out of this puzzle. It's definitely possible, but what you can do is just start typing this, right? So if you do slash material, right? Again, it's just a directory structure, and then we come in here and we type L for layer mix. There they are, right? And so then we can just pick that, get rid of that last slash, and this works great. So then you hit render. Bob's your uncle, Betty's your aunt, and there you go. This is what you would have. Now, the vegetation part is the next step of this. So we come into here and we have this tree layout. So if we come inside my tree layout, all I have is a tube here. This tube is a very simple tube. That's all it is. I'm just making a cone, much like we did the mountain. And I'm scaling it, doing a few things. I added color to it. And then I'm bringing in that same height field, right? So this is an object merge. This is that height field before we've converted it to geometry. And now we can use the height field scatter node to scatter these points on there. And normally you would do these in sequence, right? Because that way you don't get like trees occupying the same space, but I don't really care on this. I just wanted to be able to apply two different mask layers. So I have one mask layer and then I have another. And so one of these, the occlusion gave me like these big kind of like, it's in the same area as this certain rock, this more brown dirt looking rock. So it allows those to kind of make bigger patchworks of trees in certain areas. And then the other one here is using sediment, which is where these like valleys, of accumulation, you see it a lot of trees in these little valleys here, right? And that's because the snow persists there for a long time, so there's a constant supply of water to allow for those trees to grow. And then I merge those two together, and then I'm adding this shader here, which is inside of this tree layout material network, which is right here. So we come inside of here, and this is a very simple tree. It's a principled shader. It's using the point color, which is taking the color off of these trees that we defined here. We could do things where we make variation on that color based on per point attributes. Very easy to do. Just don't have it in this example. But this is a basic setup for how I would get some basic background. Trees. We could use. There's a whole in-depth tutorials that you can go get into on like how to start breaking up, adding variation to the vegetation scatter, but this is just the simple trying to get something out the door. So this is all that it took to get into this kind of quick little mountain setup, and you could make several of these and start staggering them to have some depth and range, or make big ranges out of this. I prefer to kind of merge different ranges together, right, and just kind of hide the seams of them, kind of just shoved together in intelligent ways to make what you're looking for, versus trying to have like one gigantic scene. I've done that where I've had like a 15 kilometer, 30 kilometer grid, and I'm trying to build something that's really, really giant, that you can look at all angles and run across. It adds a level of complication because there's just so much resolution. Oh, one last thing. My rock textures, they come in on all of these. If I go back out to my material network, if you go into every single one of these shaders, and you go onto the settings under scale for the UV, this allows me to change its tiling, and they're all tileable. And so I'm using smaller numbers will make it repeat more. Larger numbers will make it repeat less. So don't ask me why that is. I would think that scaling the UVs, like if I took a UV grid and this was like a square and I multiplied it, so what I would expect if I went here to UV viewport, I would expect that if the UV occupied this and I gave it a value of 4, right, that or 2 even, right, this would scale up to encompass this, and that texture map would be on each one of these tiles, which would then make it repeat more. That's how I would expect that to work. But that's not indeed how it works. When you divide or multiply it by a smaller number, you get more tiling. When you multiply it by a larger number, you get less tiling. You get a smaller section of that map. So That's how that works. So to me, it seems backwards. To you, it may seem right. And if it is, awesome for you. All right. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching.